Welcome to our webinar on data and trends in CEA, insights from the USDA Census of Agriculture. We took the Census of Agriculture, we chewed up all the parts about CEA, put it into a report, and now James and I are going to talk about it. So super jazzed, everyone who's able to join us. And as we go, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, drop things in the chat if you have any insights. And we will just kind of read the questions off as they're related to what we're doing. And this is a lot of James and I just kind of sharing what we've been seeing in these trends. So if you have insights on these trends, please do share them with us because we're also just really interested in what you other people in the industry have to say. All right, so I'm going to let Dr. James Altland introduce himself here. He's from the USDA ARS.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Glad you could join us. My name is James Altland. I'm with USDA's Agricultural Research Service, and I'm a scientist. We're the research branch of the USDA. Like a lot of scientists, we tend to be very hyper-focused on one very specific area. For me, that's the chemical and the biological properties of soilless substrates. And so we're going to be talking about a lot more than that today. But about 5 years ago, we got some directions from Congress. Congress can ask us to do very specific things, and that was to work with other agencies within the federal government on this space of controlled environment agriculture. So we work with the Office of National Programs, the Office of the Chief Scientist, NASA, the Department of Energy, the Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production, and the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, all to, so that these federal agencies and departments can work more closely and more aligned to, enhance controlled environment agriculture. So from that perspective, I do have a little more purview on it than just my very hyper-focused aspect of research. So I'm really excited to talk to Carmen about these trends today, and it should be a great conversation.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to see what you have to say from, your perspective and your context and connections around kind of the ARS side of things. So what we're talking about today is a report that Bryce and I wrote through Resource Innovation Institute, compiling and kind of curating the information from the Census of Agriculture that was published earlier this year into charts and graphs and tables and easily digestible information. It's free for RII members, including a easy spreadsheet that compiled all the data so that if people want to know the exact numbers and kind of use it for their own things, they can. For non-members, it is available for purchase, but we're going to be showing some of those charts and graphs and things today. This was published earlier this week, or late last week. I'm really excited because I finally get to share more about it. We also did a webinar last month where we talked about floriculture trends. So we're going to focus more on the food trends. There's also a public preview that's free, and a lot of these kind of graphs are in there as well. So these are the pieces that we're talking about today. The pieces that are captured in the USDA Census of Agriculture, related to CEA, related to food. We have greenhouse tomatoes. We have greenhouse fruits and berries. We have this category of other greenhouse vegetables and fresh cut herbs. So unfortunately, leafy greens people, you are lumped in there with cucumbers, basil plants, peppers, all those types of things. There is another survey where they go into a little bit more depth, but today, if you are a lettuce person, you are in that other category, but we did give you the lettuce leaf so that you could see that. And also mushrooms, which is an often forgotten slice of CEA, even though it's not kind of in greenhouses. So in the USDA Ag Census, it's compiled under this food crops grown under glass or other protection is kind of how they're categorizing it. And you can see kind of in the previous one, we talked about floriculture, but this is kind of going to break down into those greenhouse categories and the mushroom category. So let's talk about national trends. So we go through operations, area, and sales. And these are the three pieces of information that we have about these food crops. So those are kind of the slices that the USDA gives us. So on the top here, we have the food operations under protection, the food area under protection, and then food sales under protection. Now, James, there is an elephant on here.
The massive elephant in the room is that bottom chart showing mushrooms. The food sales from that very small number of food operations in a relatively small percentage of food area. Um, and that really blew me away when I saw it. And so, I did a little bit of math on that. And when you look at the value, and some of your other charts in your full report, Carmen, show the actual dollar values and the actual
Yeah.
square footage of each of these categories. This is just showing the percentage of the whole. But the value of mushrooms per acre far outpaces tomatoes. I believe it's something like, now this is just wholesale value. This doesn't take into account the cost of production and all the other things. So this is
Absolutely.
just the value. So about $300,000 per acre for tomatoes, 1.7 million for mushrooms. So for square foot, mushrooms are where it's at. And that really shocked me. And it may make us rethink a little bit about what we're doing in controlled environment agriculture. I mean, there's a lot of value there in mushroom production.
Well, and I looking at these, I would think that fruits and berries would have a smaller area and a higher sales value. And this is one where I was kind of confused here as to, just kind of like the slice of the market. I mean, it makes sense you'd have more operations than you might have area. I think a lot of places will have a small area that they grow fruits and berries in, maybe more like a permanent hoop house. Note all of these under protection. They can be flexible plastic structures, they can be glass structures, low tech, high tech, but they are permanent structures. So it's not the ones that people might drag around a field. It is the permanent ones. So I was like, oh, it makes sense that like a lot of farms that might have a lot of other things going on might have a small area they're doing some fruits and berries in. But I kind of expected the areas that might specialize towards the fruits and berries to have like a high value sales product because that is something that we talk about kind of with vertical farming, with like advanced CEA. We're talking about like leafy greens and then like berries or the next, white whale or something like that. And I don't know if this is maybe showing that that is an untapped market in maybe some areas that can't grow a lot of outdoor fruits and berries, or if this is kind of showing that fruits and berries maybe aren't all they're cracked up to be. I'm not really sure what we're looking at there. Um,
Well, going back about 10 years ago, I saw a presentation by a master's student here at Ohio State, and they were he was doing some aspect of growing strawberries in protected culture. And what part of his presentation was an economic analysis. And at that time, growing strawberries in Ohio, even in the off season, the idea was produce them off season so you don't have to compete directly with California and
mhm.
Florida. It wasn't even close. It was just you couldn't make money. Now, I just recently visited a grower here in Ohio, a very advanced greenhouse operation, and they were doing an incredible job, and they are making a profit, but selling it at a premium product.
Right,
The other aspect is so I think strawberries are just now gaining traction and maybe some of the growers out there will know better. Maybe that well, we've been doing this for 5 or 10 years and making a lot of money doing it. But it seems to me, just from what I've seen, that we're just now getting to a place where, at a premium price point, strawberries can be a competitive crop on the East Coast compared to California. The other part of that too is container grown small fruits like blueberries and caneberries. Now, I see a lot of that grown under protection. Doesn't mean they're necessarily grown in containers, or if they're in containers are under protection, but a lot of it is. So if those are to be including in that's still, I think, a little bit of the wild, wild west. We're trying to figure out that's going to
right.
be workable or functionable, or economic. But I do see it expanding in not only the United States, but around the world.
Yeah, and I think that something that CEA has been expanding in general is like crops that don't have as long of a shelf life.
Yeah.
So being able to produce something closer to where it's being consumed that don't have as much of a shelf life. Because if you're producing strawberries or berries that are on the quality of one that's being shipped across the country, you're not going to be able to be cost competitive. It's not going to be kind of worth it. So those slightly higher value products and those ones that are needing to be produced a little closer to where they're being done, like in the mushrooms world, I've seen a huge expansion of like specialty mushrooms. And to be fair, like me wanting to support my industry, I would like buy the funky specialty mushrooms in the grocery store in the plastic container, but half the time I'd get home and they'd be moldy and I would be like, what the heck? but when I buy them in the bulk bin, when I buy them from the farmer's market, so I'm really seeing like those mushrooms don't have the kind of shelf life where they can be shipped halfway across the country at all. But now you're having all these smaller mushroom farmers cropping up that are selling more locally, these specialty mushrooms that don't have as much of a shelf life. And that to me has been really interesting. And I'm seeing that expansion not insignificantly. We're not going to talk too much about mushrooms because I know that like tend to have a little bit more greenhouse people. And after a certain point, their eyes glaze over because they're like, I am not like switching to growing mushrooms.
Right,
Um,
right.
but New Jersey has been a huge expansion in mushroom production, like absolutely massive, came out of nowhere, like now in the top three or so. They had over like 1,000,000% growth in sales of mushrooms in the last 10 years. Like absolutely ridiculous, the largest growth that we had seen for any crop. I don't know what's going on in New Jersey with mushrooms, but I would love to know what's going on in New Jersey for mushrooms. And you were saying we were talking before not all those products are necessarily being sold for food. So even though this is food products, those products could be sold for other products, right?
Yeah, so what's interesting about mushrooms, two things. First of all the new growth in the mushroom market is for fresh mushrooms. So that goes to your point about the shelf life. I think mushrooms have a shelf life of like 3 days, or maybe that's the transport. It's very short though. Another one is basil, going back to
Mm.
plant.
Like the
Basil,
plant basil that you buy in the grocery store and it looks beautiful and you tell yourself you're going to make pesto every day.
yeah, exactly. Well, I've heard of growers in North Dakota starting up, with basil as the primary product because it's hard to get locally and it's hard to ship it
Mm,
in because of its shelf life issues. But the other thing with mushrooms, and this will be related back to plants in a second, but one of the interesting things about the growth of the mushroom market, a lot of it is geared towards cosmetics, not food. So the growth of the mushroom market is for these companies like the Johnson and Johnsons and the Procters and Gambles needing natural ingredients for their products. There's consumer demand for that. And I wonder to what extent are they willing to pay more than, say, the local shopper at a grocery store?
right.
And I was talking to a vertical farm grower, a particularly successful one, and they have been very successful growing leafy greens for the local grocery markets. And they said that it's their goal to be incredibly competitive and profitable in that leafy green industry. But they also mentioned that they have their eye on that natural products market to supply again, the Johnson and Johnsons of the world. And the interesting thing about vertical farming and leafy greens is that is if you can figure out the system, you can move that anywhere. You need product in Atlanta, Georgia. Sure, we could build there. What about Phoenix, Arizona? Yeah, no difference to us. So unlike, a lot of agricultural commodities, Vidalia onions have to be grown in southern Georgia. Bourbon and other things have to be grown in very specific regions, or you have at least have to have abundant water and soil. But with some of these vertical farm facilities, they can literally grow anywhere.
Yeah.
And supply those industries. So that's something to keep our eye on is how are these controlled environment agricultural markets, are they always going to be, we think about the groceries, the feeding people, but are they going to be used for other things, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, something to
Oh,
keep our eye
the
on?
food is medicine kind of area. And I think even with cannabis, like that, I think has started to break down that barrier because cannabis is both a recreational product and a medical product and an agricultural product. And so that's, I think, starting to help blur those lines between food and medicine. And not that cannabis can be food, right? It can be in edibles, but the food, the medicine, the recreational product, the kind of medical industry, and like starting to blur those lines and see that while still being very agricultural. Like when people talk about cannabis, they talk about growing cannabis. I do want to switch us real quick to these growth charts. So we have operations area sales again here. I thought it was interesting to see growth in operations when you have a decay in area. That to me is always very interesting.
Yeah.
And so that one I think is curious when you have like a really significant growth in fruits and berries, you have a growth in mushrooms, you have a decay in both of those areas. To me, what that usually says is that maybe a couple of larger players closed and maybe a bunch of smaller players are filling in. That might mean, and this is nationwide data, so that might mean that you might have one state where one big player closed and now you're having other places diversify. And maybe you're having a lot more people growing a little bit of fruits and berries in their operations, but that's not a big part of it. And a big fruits and berries farm may be closed. Or, same with mushrooms. You might have more small scale specialty mushrooms. You might have one big one maybe close, or a couple of larger operations maybe shut their doors or something like that, which is interesting. But what was interesting here to me is the growth in sales for this other category. And it's so frustrating that it's an other category because I want to know what is at 120% sales growth with only a 60% expansion in area in this other category.
So I have a question for you. In this area category, if you have a vertical farm, I mean, some of these things, they're 10 layers high.
Mhm.
So on a say an acre footprint, you have 10 acres of production. And if you're turning over that, 8 times a year, whatever it is, that could explain. I mean, if that's others, veggies and herbs are all leafy greens and premium leafy greens, salad greens, and that sort of thing, that might explain that to some extent. Without expanding the area too much, you can
Right.
quadruple.
Well, for the category and the way that it's described in the specialty crop census, which is the one that they're going to be surveying for the end of this year's data, they do specify that if it's a vertical farm, like each layer counts as an area if you like lay it all out. So that's how
Okay.
it's supposed to be reported. Is that how everyone reports it? Who knows? But I will say that like compared to greenhouse area, vertical farming area is still such a small amount. Right now it's not separated out in any capacity, and I would love for that to be the future. So if you are in here and you're angry that vertical farms are not being called out specifically, go email the USDA and complain. If they get enough
Not me.
complaints, they might actually change it. Um, but yeah, so I think it's unlikely that that is really what's driving this. And again, I don't know if it's leafy greens. I don't know if it is herbs. I don't know if it's some other product that is totally off of my radar here. But that to me is very interesting. That is like by far the most growth um, there. Let's keep talking about greenhouse products. So here are our operations and area. We're kind of pulling out the sales because it starts to track kind of similarly. So here are our state by state statuses for just the greenhouse products. We pulled the mushrooms out. We talked about mushrooms, but now we're looking at greenhouses. Um, what I think is interesting here is that you have California by far larger than anybody else when it comes to area. But when it comes to number of operations, they're over here at like number 7 or 8. So what that tells me is that those states above them have a lot of small facilities, while California has some really big facilities. And I think that tracks really well to what we know about those areas. But I think it's also interesting to see like Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Washington having the most food operations using greenhouses, which is just really cool to like check that out.
Yeah, and I guess what's a little bit, I'd love to hear from some West Coast people. And I know you're from Washington. Um, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, that makes sense to me. They're kind of in the center of the United States. They're accessible. They can reach most of the country's population within one day or, to be classified as a local food. But Washington's up there in the corner. And yes, you have Seattle, but it's a relatively small population for a state. So to have that number of operations in kind of the corner of the United States, that's what surprises me a little bit about that. And what do you know about Washington? It's what's going on there.
Well, I've been here for a year, so I could tell you what I've learned in the last year of Washington. I am a native New Yorker, so I can say that there's a lot of things about Washington that remind me of upstate New York. So I grew up in upstate New York, and upstate New York is a lot of small family farms. It's a lot of farms that have maybe some greenhouse over here, maybe have some field stuff over there, maybe have some animal products over there, maybe have an orchard, those kinds of things. And part of why I was really excited to move to Washington is that having lived in Denver, where it is a high desert and it is dry, 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 dry. Moving back to what or moving to Washington, it felt a little bit like moving closer to home. You have these lakes and these rivers. A lot of Washington is very agricultural. And I think you're having these kind of mixed products. Now, I would say that the Seattle area is super mild, so you don't actually really get snow predictably. You get like a sprinkling to shut things down, but not really this like big snow. But as you go further east in Washington, you do. So it makes sense to me that if you have Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that type of weather, that type of agricultural kind of culture carrying over into Washington makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah,
And having, and these again, these are operations that have these products under protection. It does not mean it's their primary product. It does not mean that it even makes up 10% of their area. So I think having these farms that have a lot of diverse products that might be adapting, might be a little more consumer facing, being in those areas, I think are a lot more common. And that's a totally different business model than California. I think California tends to have these like big agricultural, like what we do here is ag, and this is our specialty product, versus I think in those kind of upper states with a lot of operations, maybe not as much area. Although, I mean, Ohio's number two for area, New York is number four, Michigan is what, number six. So, but compared to California, that just, blows them out of the water.
right.
So I think that's one. The other one I wanted to ask you about is looking at the area. So everyone seems to do a lot of tomatoes, right? Except California obviously has this huge other category that makes sense. I see Texas with a whole lot of fruits and berries. I see North Carolina with a whole lot of fruits and berries. And then I'm looking at Florida, and Florida doesn't grow any tomatoes. Florida is
Yeah.
all this other category. Do you have any insight there?
So I reached out, some of the best people to answer these questions are the statewide extension specialists at those universities. So I reached out to some friends at the University of Florida. They told me that tomatoes are very difficult to grow in Florida because of an insect vector virus, like tomato yellow leaf curl virus.
Okay.
Uh,
And
so there,
insects get into greenhouses.
yeah,
That's where they would rather be.
if you've ever been to Florida, I mean, in Florida, what we call a greenhouse in Pennsylvania and Ohio, I mean, it's very closed. In Florida, it's a lot more open because they have a climate. They don't need to be as closed up as much. They have more light. They have more. They have temperatures more conducive to growing plants year round. Um, and so he mentioned that there's a lot of interest in leafy greens and fresh cut herbs and cucumbers, colored peppers, that sort of thing. So I think it's just, what that environment will allow. And tomatoes are just more difficult to grow than some of these other crops. So they grow what is profitable.
Yeah. Really, really interesting. I love to see because you see a little bit of consistency and then you see just like odd patterns. You're like, what's going on in that state? So let's look at growth. So this is for all these food products, the previous chart growth in operations, and then again on area on the other side. The ones that I think are really interesting are where you see growth in one area and decline in another area. And unfortunately, if a state did not report, um, I think one of these categories we didn't include them. So that's why you have all these zeros. So it could be that it's zero or close to zero. It could be that that state didn't report. And there's a handful of them that tend not to report. So like North Dakota, South Dakota tend not to report. And those, as well as a couple of smaller states that probably don't have very many. So when they choose or they report, but it's not published, it has like a D, they're not disclosing it in order to protect business interests, which I think is very responsible, but it does kind of create some odd gaps as we go.
Yeah.
Now, West Virginia came out of nowhere growing all sorts of stuff, which is really very, very interesting to me. Do you have any West Virginia insights, or are we just surprised?
Well, I look at this. I don't have any insights from West Virginia, but I look at the number of operations have grown, but the food area, not so much. My guess is they went from a few operations to a few more, and the area didn't expand that greatly. That's just a numbers
Yeah.
game.
Or maybe they swapped over something from one product to another product. There's a couple reasons why that number might be small, but it's interesting to have a 250% growth in people growing food in greenhouses, even if it's not necessarily like big operators coming online. Because that to me, like the number of operations is how many people are now growing these products. And the area is like how big are those businesses? And that's kind of how I think of it and why I think it's important to look at them together, because they can tell a very different story. Kentucky here, though, had an 800% increase in area. They had what, like 100 and change percent increase in operations. So that means that's not just like one or two big players coming on. Although I guess technically it can be the same business. So number of operations can be separate businesses in different plots of land. But still, I mean, that's a pretty significant increase overall. Granted, if someone started low and they had a 100% increase, it might have gone from 2 farms to 4 farms or something like that. But that's again why we looked at the previous chart. Now we look at this chart. Um, uh, Kyle just dropped in the chat talking about App Harvest potentially being Kentucky, but I don't think that App Harvest put in how many operations, so that's not just the area, it's also the number of operations. So, oh, 4, someone said 4. So that might be in Kentucky a big chunk of that. So it's always interesting to see where some of those things go. Also the people that so the operators that you work with and seeing how they might carry through some of this data. Now, this is all 2022 data. So it was collected for the year 2022. The sales are for the year 2022. The operations are for the year 2022. So speaking of App Harvest, do we want to talk about tomatoes?
We can talk about tomatoes, yeah.
So here are tomatoes. I think tomatoes looks very similar to our overall greenhouse, like the same patterns. You have the same players at the top. You have, that California, although again, California doesn't have that much tomatoes compared to other things. But Kentucky kind of moved up in these rankings. So, with maybe the growth of App Harvest. And there's some discussion going on there. And then we've got tomato growth, right? So again, we've got this West Virginia number that I think is really interesting. And I'm not sure what's going on in West Virginia. Also Ohio,
Well,
which I think is
Ohio's interesting. We're getting a lot of expansion from, I think it's a lot of expansion from the Leamington, Ontario region
right.
into Ohio. And, these growers, I mean, there's still an incredibly powerful growing area there in Leamington, but they're trying to, well, they have been expanding into the US market. Probably it makes it easier than crossing the border. Also, it allows them to utilize, the local label a little more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio is an interesting place. We have a lot of fresh water. Ohio's been incredibly competitive in reducing tax rates on infrastructure. They have a really competitive infrastructure system in terms of highways and bimodal transportation.
Absolutely.
I think we're like within 600 miles of 60% of the US population. USDA says anything within 400 miles is local. I don't know what that percentage is, but I imagine there's a lot of people living within 400 miles of Ohio.
Well, and I
So
think that if the Leamington kind of like southern Canada area, that climate is going to be very similar to Ohio. So
absolutely.
if you learned how to do your greenhouses there, you kind of had like the Dutch come into that southern Canada area. They really figured out that climate, and now they're just kind of like hopping right over the border.
Yeah.
Which could definitely account for some of that expansion. Because again, these don't necessarily have to be one like are all different growers, all different operations. They can be similar operations, but like the same owner in multiple locations. And I think that some of the expansions that we're definitely seeing in certain states that seem like they're coming out of nowhere. And previously someone had mentioned in the Q&A about Pennsylvania, those growers expanding into New Jersey and that potentially being that New Jersey mushroom expansion. I think there's a lot of that, like, oh, this nearby state has um, potentially favorable uh, legal, regulatory type conditions and similar climate conditions, and it's pretty close to where we already are. Let's just hop over the border, and then you kind of see those little, almost like expansions of empires that I think are very interesting.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree 100%. Yeah, and I think that's exactly what happened with Ohio and in the expansion of tomato production in Ohio. And I think someone in the comment mentioned that management from Leamington can get to Ohio within a day, and that's absolutely right. We've made that drive several times, and um, yeah, they can run their operation right from Leamington, and
Yeah,
it's
and
been very
that's I honestly think that business logistics tends to be the harder part of CEA. I think that we're pretty good at growing things in CEA. I think that the downfall of a lot of businesses is figuring out their market logistics. You can grow a ton of stuff, but if you can't sell it, if you can't distribute it, if you can't manage your business, like those types of things, I think are really where the downfall comes. And part of why I think CEA tends to have a lot of these very distributed areas because it's you figure out your market. And I see a lot of benefit to like CEA having relationships with like chefs, with restaurants, with the culinary industry. I think that tends to be a really beneficial for like small and mid-sized operations, having those relationships so that they have this predictable, steady, high value product that is like consistent and desirable and year round. And they have those like local relationships developed, especially, but even on a larger scale, like those higher value CEA products with a lower shelf life. But you have a customer that you know. It's not that you're taking your mushrooms to the farmer's market and seeing what you could sell. It's that you have all of these orders from these different culinary relationships and you take what's left over to the farmer's market and see if you can sell that. And I think that's also more beneficial maybe for a lot of smaller and medium-sized growers than those grocery store relationships, because those grocery store relationships can be really hard. And whether or not your product sells and how much they want and those types of things can be really hard to calibrate. And if you're left with leftover product that you can't sell, it doesn't keep forever. And if you're
right.
selling higher value products, it keeps even less. And I think that's often the struggle. So if people have figured out their business model and they understand how it works and they can just expand a little bit over the state border or over the country border, I think that is something we see a lot of.
Well, and it's interesting you say that. One of the most successful vertical farm companies in the United States, I was speaking with their management team, and their core management team comes from a background not in horticulture or production, but in food distribution and logistics.
Yeah, I think that's that key.
They spoke to us for about an hour and gave us a master class on how product sells on a grocery store
Oh,
shelf.
wow.
And they knew the metrics that they understood and on how that's measured and how it's tracked and what that means and how to develop their product to, excel in that environment. As a horticulturist, I grow stuff. I don't know anything about the grocery
Yeah,
store
I'm an
shelf.
engineer.
These
I
are
love that I
fascinating.
don't have to be in charge of money. That's one of my favorite things about my job.
So, but you're right. The people who understand the food distribution system seem to be the ones that are successful now. And whether that's you're a small grower and you figured out how the local chef market works, or these large vertical farms that have understand more regional scale grocery stores, those are the ones that I see being successful in and around Ohio.
Well, and I think that you have, like, especially for these bigger farms, the quiet majority of greenhouses are either they have greenhouses as part of a much larger farm system that they're growing all sorts of things on, and they have kind of their old school farming regional relationships, or the big ones are just quietly making tomatoes or making peppers or making cucumbers or making leafy greens. And they've been doing it the same way they've been doing it. And they're not in the news and they're not seeking venture capital money. And they're just quietly much more on that kind of relationship side of like USDA government relationships, less on the side of PR, anything like that. A lot of them, like, you go and buy all these like the cherry tomatoes and the flavor bombs and all of these really delightful like you don't even know they're greenhouse grown. You could look at that package, you could search that package and you will have no idea that they're greenhouse grown. They are just quietly churning out tomatoes that they have perfected exactly the breeding that they want in order to give customers like a desirable product. And that's really think the quiet majority of what's going on there. And they figured out their business process, they figured out their distribution, they figured out those relationships. And I think it's really interesting because, if you spend too much time talking to these research people, you start to kind of lose track of that. And you have a lot of people who tell you that, leafy greens are going to be grown in completely robotic vertical farms and humans will not touch leafy greens in the next 10 years and they have to cost 10x what they do right now to be profitable. And I'm like, have you been to a farm? Do you see what people are doing today? Nobody is going to have fully robotic lettuce in a couple years. Like, you're cray.
Well, that's a great question about have you been to a farm? So we have a question from Greenway Farms in Maryland, and I'm wondering if we could address that regarding the way that the USDA captures any sort of production techniques from like hydroponics to aquaponics to those sort of media questions. What have you found in your research?
Yeah, so media questions less so in this report. This report is much more just about kind of operations area. It doesn't really slice and dice very much. There's like a little bit where they tried to capture a little bit of hydroponics, I believe, in there, but it wasn't really significant. This winter, they are publishing their irrigation and water report. And while that doesn't necessarily have as much about soil production systems, it does have watering systems. And there's a lot that you can infer about watering systems. So they have an entire slice of food grown under glass or other protection that then has the different watering systems laid out. So keep an eye out early next year. We're going to publish a report that dives into that a little bit, and we can make some inferences about different types of production methodology, or even just potentially high-tech greenhouses versus not, based on that watering system. So it's all kind of on the irrigation side. But James, do you know, being the soil scientist here, about any chunks of USDA data about substrates?
No, so, in the Agricultural Research Service, we do not collect any data on grower operations or who's doing what and how much and that sort of thing. That is a completely different agency. And it could be one of two different agencies. And it's way outside of my sandbox. So I'm just not even that close. I'm not related to that effort at all. So I really can't speak to it at all.
As much as we would love for this survey to include every piece of information, it is also already 800 pages long. So it is 800 pages of teeny tiny tables that is absolutely brutal. Okay, so we have somebody in the comments that was saying the USDA publishes data about agricultural expenses on growing media. So you can get some information from that for sure. I'm not sure if they separate out that under protection kind of category. And that's where some of the overall USDA data is awesome, but it might not actually take out that slice of CEA for us to really understand what this section looks like. So definitely, look into that and see what you can find. There's amazing amounts of data that the USDA gathers and publishes publicly, annually, even monthly, but it can be a little bit difficult to sift through. And so often we'll get the question about like response rate. So there is not a 100% response rate for the USDA Ag Census. It's about 75%. And to me, that means that these percentages, these overall trends are very interesting. But if I was going to take those hard numbers and try to do something with those hard numbers, I would want to have like a factor, maybe add 25%, maybe, have something in there. All right, you want to talk about some of these other ones? So this is this other category that includes leafy greens, peppers, cucumbers, all the things that they really break down in the specialty crop census. So, similar players here, like we have the Michigan, California, New York. I think Wisconsin came up here. We didn't really see Wisconsin too high earlier. We got the Washington, Ohio, Pennsylvania. And then here we have California, obviously, with that huge other section. I'm kind of curious as to how much of that in California is leafy greens versus peppers, cucumbers, other specialty products. And I thought it was interesting that Florida came up, because Florida hasn't really had that many operations in a lot of these. I mean, it's coming in like mid, right? That's like 10 or 15 back. But now it's coming up. So it looks like we have some larger operations in Florida than we do have number of operations in Florida.
Well, what the extension agent from Florida told me was that they have the single largest leafy greens operation in the country, and they're over 120 acres, which is
Wow.
mind-boggling. Now it's all high tunnels.
Okay.
So technically, I think,
Low
CEA,
tech.
but low tech, yes. Now, and so that probably explains the Florida blip. What I think is interesting, if you look, the number of operations is interesting, but the square footage at the bottom, going from Ohio all the way, there's a California blows the scale a little bit. So
Oh
if you
yeah.
move California from that, you might get a little more resolutionist, but there's a lot of uniformity from Ohio down to the next 10 or 15
Like
states all the way
North
down.
Carolina-ish.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it seems, and that makes sense to me. Greenhouse operations, they can be located irregardless of the soil type. You just need fresh water. So you are going to want to locate them near population centers. So there's going to be more uniform distribution of that, production throughout the United States. So yeah, that kind of makes sense to me in terms of populations. North Dakota's at the very bottom,
Yep.
Nevada, Wyoming, South Dakota, and then the states with the larger populations have more operations. That's kind of what I see in that square footage chart.
And I always try to pay attention to where Hawaii is. And sometimes Alaska. Alaska's had some interesting expansions in different areas, but I just try to pay attention to those because they really are very different geographically. And, we talk a lot about distribution systems for a lot of these other states that we see growth in. Um, so looking at the growth here. But I always like to just kind of pay attention to that. And there I noticed Hawaii was pretty far back in number of operations, but not far back in area. So again, that's going to give you that similar track. But here we've got Kentucky with an 800% growth in area growing other vegetables and herbs. So a lot of that Kentucky growth might not have necessarily been tomato focused, which is very interesting to me. That huge growth in Kentucky and again in West Virginia. So, we have that West Virginia growth and that Kentucky growth and that other. Now, something that was interesting from the previous meeting where we talked about floriculture was there was a significant dip in a couple of floriculture categories, specifically like cut flowers in area, but operations grew in almost every state. And so I think there were some big cut flowers operations and maybe some big floriculture operations that potentially swapped over into this other category. And I think that's part of that national expansion that we saw. But I also think that it's potentially, because greenhouses are greenhouses, and whether you're going floriculture or food, a lot of those, I would say medium tech greenhouses can very easily switch between them, and the conditions
Absolutely.
they have.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
hard to figure out.
Well, I look at this West Virginia thing again, and I think, being from near West Virginia, driving through West Virginia quite a bit, it reminds me of a lot of what you were explaining about Washington for different reasons. They're not going to have massive mega farms down there, although there may be some, I don't know. But a lot of small, family operated farms,
Yep.
which would totally explain why they have the number of operations that are growing so dramatically, but the area staying relatively small.
Yeah, and again, having those diversifications. I think a lot of farms are talking about weather being a lot harder to manage, whether that's too much water, not enough water, just weird, funky weather, and those greenhouses really give you that ability to bridge that. There's a couple other ones that I think are interesting. So like Tennessee reported about 150% increase in operations, but they did not report their area. So that
Yeah.
might mean, and typically there's some states that I think are a little bit more conservative just because they often have Ds, but also that might mean that there is like even if there is say 10 physical locations, if it's one business, then that would be not wanted to be revealed, or if it makes up too much of it. I don't know exactly what their rules are for a D, but it's interesting when you have a significant growth in operations, but no data on area. So you have no idea where they actually land in area.
And it's suspicious that they would know the number of operations, but not the area.
Well,
Or
it's reported, but it's not
okay.
published publicly. So the USDA knows, but they're not telling us to protect business interests.
I understand. So the D is not because nobody raised their hand, it's because the USDA had some reason to keep that
Yes.
undisclosed.
And I don't know who makes that decision or what their criteria are for it. I do understand that it's basically about like, you know, if you have three farms and, you know, you publish the number, they can pretty easily find out what their competitors are or something like
Right.
that, which is something that we take into account anytime that we publish data from people who participate in all of our benchmarking, just to, you know, protect their business interests. So I completely understand that, but I don't know what their criteria is, and I don't know if it varies state to state.
Right.
And I can't tell if there's certain states. And when I say there's certain states that hardly report anything, I'm saying they don't report on Christmas trees, they don't report on maple syrup, that like they put a D in almost every category that they can, um, which is always very interesting to me. Uh, do I think that maybe those states have different criteria for not disclosing? I'm leaning towards that, but I don't necessarily know if the states get to have different criteria or if it is like an overall USDA policy.
Now, and again, this is a completely different agency that does this work from the agency I work for.
Yeah.
And you seem to be closer to this than I am. So are they getting information from the states, or because NAS is a
I don't know
federal
how it
agency?
filters through, and I don't know who gets to make those
Okay.
decisions.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm really not sure. Everything that I know about how this is surveyed is included in the like first section of this report that is also in the public preview because I wanted to be super clear um about where we got it from. But I'm not exactly sure, but there's definitely some where I'm like, I'm sorry, they had a what expansion where and now they're not telling us? Like, come on, guys.
Right.
Um, Definitely always interesting. So there is that like pattern in there. I do want to talk a little bit about fruits and berries because I think there's some interesting states at the top here. So North Carolina, which isn't really significant in most other categories, is like at the top of the food chain in fruits and berries. Competitively with Texas here, it looks like there's probably some really big Texas farms. And again, fruits and berries makes up that smaller slice, but I think fruits and berries is an interesting one and one that's expanding.
Well,
Um,
here, so I talked to the people from North Carolina. They had no idea.
no
They
idea.
had no clue.
Well,
So,
because like this is their growth. Look at our
well,
North
and
Carolina bar.
how
What
did
the
they
heck?
not know? Well, here's the thing. In 2012, Texas had 8 operations in fruits and berries covering 24,000 square feet. That's half an acre. 2022, they had 57 operations covering 1.2 million square feet. So that is
Yeah.
incredible. And similar numbers for North Carolina, 8 operations at 6,000 square feet in 2012 grew to 75 operations covering 1 million square feet in 2022. So something happened, and it goes back to your point where not a lot of these farmers are always making a lot of noise and
Right.
letting North Carolina State and University know that they're there, and they've just expanded 1,000 acres or whatever it is. So it's shocking, but I'm surprised that our statewide people don't know this
Well, and
from those
with
universities.
that kind of growth, especially like North Carolina, it was not just in area. It's not just that there's a handful of businesses that put in like three operations that are huge. It's what, 8 to 75. What is huge growth? Huge
And
growth, 1,000% expansion in 10 years in North Carolina. I would think that there was some kind of like statewide berry farm thing going on. But if the US, like, if you guys don't know, if like the people who are supposed to be rolling out the statewide stuff don't know, like, I just am always really curious about that because it really what it says to me is that like the USDA hasn't quite figured out how to serve CEA. They haven't quite figured out how to be in lockstep. A lot of the programs that are serving other traditional farmers that like the US, like if they know where they want to get a loan, they know they go to the USDA. If they want to buy a tractor, they go to the USDA. Like they are lockstep with the USDA. They understand that relationship. They understand the benefits both ways. And I just think for CEA, like, oh, well, if I'm going to throw up a greenhouse, either they're a traditional farmer and they're using whatever they've got anyway, or if they're starting from scratch, if they're coming in from the food distribution side of things or something, oh, well, I don't see anything the USDA has for me. I don't know where I fit into the USDA, and they're not building those relationships. And I think
Well,
that the USDA has a lot of work to do to make those connections.
and it's not just the USDA, it's the entire federal government. And
Yeah.
this is a whole nother hour conversation. So, and we could derail this really fast. But um, I was just at a meeting, a joint federal agency meeting in Charlotte, Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the big conversation was vertical farms, maybe greenhouses, but vertical farms especially, are they agriculture or are they industry? And that's a big deal. And another, to your point, we don't understand this new production. You look at the H-2A labor program, it's, one of the big problems is, and I don't know all the details about this, it's far outside of my sandbox, but they can't, we need employees year round for these greenhouses and vertical farms.
Which is a
But the
better job than seasonal labor.
Absolutely, but the H-2A doesn't allow for that in the United States. In Canada, their related program, I don't know what they call it, but it does allow, they have much better immigration laws there that allow for that year-round farm worker type status thing.
Yeah.
So there are several areas in which the federal government doesn't quite understand what it's dealing with CEA. And they need to do a better job. I would say, from research, we're doing a great job, but in terms of regulating, which is far outside of what I do, but the regulation space needs, and I don't know what the solution to that is. Industry leaders really need to get a grapple, and they understand the problem. Some of the umbrella organizations like the CEA Alliance, I think they're trying to do they're doing a good job trying to get their hands around it and move the industry forward. But there's a lot of work to do in that.
Yeah,
In
and I
that
think
part.
there has been some relationship building, and Elise, you might be able to tell me more about it because that's less of my department, but between various senators, their work on the Farm Bill, having the Farm Bill understand CEA a little bit and building of those relationships. I know that the CEA Alliance has been doing work in building those kind of like government ag relationships that I think is really valuable. When we did our conference last year. So last year, the year before, 2 years ago. What year is it? We did have like some government representation with those relationships that we've built. I don't know, Elise, if you have a little bit more to say about those relationships.
Yeah, well, I'm curious for the people calling in who may or may not represent the states with the growth. Is there policy that has been driving that growth in Texas and North Carolina that we can think of?
Yeah, is there a policy or is it, one or two big businesses? Kip is here noting about the relatively new Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production, which I believe was kind of dreamt to be a little bit more like urban agriculture, like community farm focused, and kind of was pushed to redirect to include CEA more significantly. I know that maybe it's not deeply ingrained in like the goal of it originally, but I know that they've really pushed to make sure that it's included in that innovative production kind of side of things, as well as like there is a lot of urban ag expansion. Is the majority of CEA in urban agriculture? I would say no, but I do think that especially like container farms, vertical farms, and then a lot of rooftop greenhouses and just kind of community spaces have also expanded in that area. Um,
Kip, did you learn from South Carolina with the policy discussion beyond labor? Was there sort of states that you found that were leading in at least the development of these farms? Oh, sorry, James, that was for you. I'm sorry, James. Not Kip. I'm reading Kip's name.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Sorry, James.
Sorry,
When
what
you were
was the
in South
question?
Carolina. When you were in South Carolina at the conference, did you find that the discussion maybe talked about growth in some of these states and what is leading that way?
No, I mean, in the South Carolina conference, we didn't talk about individual states and what's happening here and what's happening there. And I talked to a woman at Texas A&M University, and I talked to two gentlemen at North Carolina State University, and neither one of them knew about the growth. And I see Kyle Friedman, says from North Carolina, he's seen a lot of this expansion. And I know Kyle works directly with the growers. So he may see that more than, say, a statewide university extension specialist would. So that's good, input from Kyle. And looks like he has maybe even some
a resource there, which is awesome. I'll have to look at it after the meeting. And I'm seeing Kelsey Graham here talking about Utah. I have seen so much growth in floriculture, in food, in Utah in general, and I'm like very interested in that. I think it's one where they don't always necessarily report the area, but there has been significant expansion in almost every greenhouse crop that we've looked at in Utah, which I know that, Salt Lake City has a really significant population. I don't know very much about Utah. I did drive through there recently. They have some very nice dog parks that I stopped at on my way to Washington. But really seeing a lot of expansion in Utah. And here Kelsey's talking about the support on the research extension support for growers, on the state funding, and things like that. So, I'm really interested to see. I almost want to look at some of the states that have had like the most continuous growth and looking at the states, then what supports them? Like what is creating that growth? Someone earlier did mention like, what about cannabis? And the thing about cannabis is that maybe some of these greenhouses in some of those states where you can do that might have switched to growing cannabis, or in places like California, where maybe the market got super competitive and they were growing cannabis, now they switched back to something else. And when you're looking at the crop specific information that is showing up, maybe in adding or subtracting out different crops for operations in area, but it does have maybe a thumb on the scale in some of those states. And unfortunately, the USDA is not allowed to collect that information. So we have no idea what's actually happening in those states as far as operations in area for cannabis. But they do report on hemp.
Yep.
As of this year, first time ever, they're reporting on hemp.
Exciting progression. Well, Carmen, we have 2 minutes left in
Awesome.
today's presentation. So I just wanted to see if there are any remaining questions or final comments from you and James. We really appreciate you bringing all this information to this audience, and everyone who is participating. It's been really fun engaging with you.
Yeah, I will just hand it off to James if he has any closing comments, things that we didn't get to talk about, optimistic, looking into the future stuff.
I don't know that I can look into the future too far. I think this industry, CEA in general, greenhouse and vertical farms, has a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of different markets that are available to our growers. So it's going to be exciting. I think the only constant is that there's going to be change moving forward. So, just hold on tight and keep following Carmen. She'll lead the way, but these industry trends are interesting, and it's always fun to just talk about things. And so this is a really good outlet, Carmen. And you see this at some of these conferences as well, where we have panels, and it's just interesting to hear the different perspectives on what we're seeing and why we're seeing it. And so yeah, I appreciate you hosting this, and it's been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. And I'm so glad we got to chat about some of the trends that we're seeing. I'll close us out on, this is the report. It has 50 something pages of these types of trends. There is a public preview. It's free for members, available for purchase for non-members. And feel free to send me emails about it or send the USDA complaints about it. And thank you so much for coming.
Or praises.
I am so impressed that this data is collected and they have a 75% response rate. That's amazing to me. But yeah, thank you so much, James. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Brenna. Thank you, everyone who came. And I hope you all have a lovely day.